If you are a saxophone player who is trying to improve your tone, or you're trying to figure out how to get a sound similar to one of your favorite saxophone players, then you are definitely going to want to check out this tutorial. What's up, everybody? My name is Paddock, and today I am coming to you from my practice studio in Playa del Carmen, Mexico. This practice studio is in a music store, so you are most likely going to hear some music store sounds in the background. But the show must go on, so let's get started. When it comes to getting a really great sound on the saxophone, it's all about the air. So we're going to be talking about how we get the air from your lungs to the saxophone and the way your saxophone equipment reacts to the air that you're blowing into it. Once you figure out how to work with the variables of getting your air into the saxophone, you're going to be able to really improve your tone as well as change it to sound like whatever saxophone tone you want. Now, when we're talking about a saxophone tone or a saxophone sound, there are a zillion different examples. We have everyone from Cannonball Adderley to Paul Desmond to Michael Brecker to Stan Getz. And they all sound completely different. So there is no perfect sound. It's all what sounds good to you and what your personal preference is. Before we dive into the rest of this tutorial, leave me a comment below with your favorite saxophone player's sound. For me, my all-time favorite sax player sound is probably Cannonball Adderley. Let's start off with blowing air into the saxophone. So the air comes from your lungs, it goes into the saxophone. We have two main variables that we have to think about that can drastically change your sound one way or the other. The first one is your speed. All that means is how hard or how fast you're blowing air into the saxophone. And the second one is the pattern of your airstream. All that means is how tight or loose your airstream is going into the mouthpiece. That means how centered your air is as you're blowing it in. If you use those two variables and you change them around a little bit, you'll be able to get pretty much any saxophone sound that you want, as long as that lines up with the gear that you have. We'll talk about gear in a little bit later on in this tutorial. The speed of your air is all about how hard you are blowing into the saxophone. So the more air you're blowing into the saxophone, obviously the bigger your sound is going to be, and the less air that you are blowing into the saxophone, the softer your sound is going to be. So if you're looking for a big, powerful sound, you're going to want to push a whole bunch of air into the saxophone. If you're looking for a more mellow, laid-back sound, you want to limit the amount of air that you're going into the saxophone. Now, once you find your mezzo forte, your regular dynamic level of sound, then you're going to adjust it accordingly by pushing in more air or less air to make it louder or softer. But you want to start off by finding that medium level sound that you want. Now, for me personally, I have a big, bright, in-your-face sound. So I am moving a lot of air into the saxophone. If I put in a lot less air, it's definitely softer, but you can also hear how the sound spreads out a little bit. Now, I'm going to talk about equipment a little bit later in this video, but my equipment is set up to have a really big, in-your-face, bright sound. So when I try to pull it back, my equipment doesn't really want to do that. If you're watching this tutorial, I'm assuming that you are a saxophone player that would like to take your playing to the next level. If that's the case, I'd like to invite you to check out the Paddock Sax School. In the Sax School, I take the guesswork out of what to practice, how to practice, and what to practice next, and give you step-by-step lessons on how to improve just about any aspect of your saxophone playing. So if you'd like to check out the Paddock Sax School, I'll put a link in the description below. Now let's talk about the second variable of Airstream Pattern. The tighter your Airstream pattern is, in other words, how tight the air is that you're blowing. Me personally, I blow very tight airstream right into the center of my mouthpiece, and because I do that, I get a really crisp, bright, clean sound. If I were blowing in a wider airstream pattern, that would give me a wider and maybe even a fuzzier and darker sound. Now, again, with my mouthpiece setup, I'm not going to be able to do that very easily, but when it comes to getting the sound you want to think about the airstream pattern that you're playing with. So I'm going to play Summertime one more time. I'm going to do it in the lower octave, and I'm going to start off playing it the way I normally play. You can hear that that is a pretty powerful sound, and that is because I have a really tight airstream going into the center of my mouthpiece. Now I am going to widen that airstream, and you're going to hear that sound get a little bit darker and a little bit more mellow. So the two variables that you want to start working on to find the saxophone sound that is perfect for you are 1, the speed of the air that is going into the saxophone, and 2, how tight or loose that airstream is. A really easy way to think about this concept is that the faster your air is moving, the more your reed is going to vibrate. The more your reed vibrates, the bigger your sound is going to be. So if you want a really big, fat, in-your-face sound, you're going to have a lot of air moving in a really tight airstream. But if you want a darker, more fuzzy, or more classic jazz sound, you're going to have slower air moving in a less tight airstream. Once you have your air speed and your airstream dialed in, another thing you can do is play around with your tongue position. In the saxophone world, we call that voicing. I like to call it tongue position. You can move your tongue position up or down, forward or back a little bit, and that's also going to have a pretty drastic effect on your saxophone tone. I suggest getting your air speed and your airstream down before you do anything with your tongue. But once you get that down, play around with the position of your tongue a little bit, and you're going to see that that can affect your sound also. But it may also affect your intonation, so you might have to adjust your mouthpiece accordingly. Now that we've talked about getting your air into the saxophone, let's talk about how your saxophone reacts to that air. Now, we could definitely talk about your reed, your ligature, and your saxophone, but I want to limit this mainly to your mouthpiece because that's going to have the biggest effect on reacting to your air. Your mouthpiece has 3 main parts that control how the air goes into the saxophone, and these 3 parts all have a very big effect on your saxophone tone. So the first one is your tip opening. The tip opening is the distance between the reed and the mouthpiece. So the larger the tip opening, the more air you can get into the saxophone. The more air you can get into the saxophone, the bigger your sound is going to be. The less air you get into the mouthpiece, the darker or more fuzzy your saxophone tone is going to be. From the tip opening, we go to the baffle. So the baffle is the slope that is on the internal part of the beak of your mouthpiece. I have a really high baffle. When you have a really high baffle, that gets your air moving faster. Again, the faster your air is moving, the bigger your sound is going to be, and oftentimes it's going to make it a lot brighter as well, especially when you have a high baffle. So if you're looking for a contemporary bright pop or funk sound, you're most likely going to be using a high baffle mouthpiece to make that a lot easier. Now, if you have a low baffle mouthpiece or a mouthpiece without much of a baffle at all, you're going to have a darker sound and it's going to get fuzzier. So what that's going to do is slow the air down. The high baffle speeds your air up. The low baffle slows your air down. So when you have a low baffle, that's going to give you a more classic jazz sound. So again, when we're talking about how the air goes through your mouthpiece, we're talking about the speed of the air and the airstream pattern. So you can hear the difference. Here are a couple plain examples of me using different mouthpieces. As you can hear, there is a very big difference in my tone when I am playing on a mouthpiece with a high baffle as opposed to when I'm playing on a mouthpiece without much baffle at all. When it comes to getting your perfect sound on the saxophone, it all comes down to how fast you're moving your air into the saxophone and how tight your airstream pattern is. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. If you'd like to dive deeper into my saxophone world, I'd like to invite you to check out the Scott Paddock Sax School.